My friends, the wait is nearly over. Brigandine Abyss's release date has finally been revealed. It is coming to us August 26th, 2026 on Steam, and August 27th, 2026 on PS5, Switch 2, and the Xbox Series. If that's all you wanted to know, by all means, you can click away now. Just please do leave a like and a subscribe before you go if you'd like to hear more Brigandine news in the future. However, if you want to hear about the details we've seen in this trailer, as well as my personal hands-on experience playing the game at PAX East, then watch on. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone, it is a fine day to be discussing more news about an excellent looking and, from my experience, pretty fun to play upcoming turn-based strategy RPG, especially when we get the release date for it, and it is coming very, very soon. This release date trailer was more story-focused than gameplay-focused, primarily centered around introducing our new factions, though there were a couple of gameplay clips of the heroes doing their thing, which we can discuss as well, and those new factions are as follows, in no particular order. We have Grand Dragnica, led by hero Largo, the Scarlet Will, led by Garnet, who definitely doesn't look like Cordelia from Fire Emblem Awakening, not even a little bit. The Kingdom of Mistine, represented by its hero Zelzard. A Fey Village Purifino, which I'm definitely not pronouncing right, led by Alice Bell. The Samurai clan, not the Samurai clan, make sure that you keep that specific, headed up by Saya. And then Pandemian, which is represented, though definitely not led by none other than Type F, the edgiest edgelord to ever edge across 2026. All of these factions are in one way or another going to be caught up in the conflict caused by the return of the titular Abysloa, and how that conflict is going to go for them is going to largely depend on what their history with the kingdom is. We've gotten some story details about this in the past. We won't focus on that too much right now. Just know that that is going to be the primary antagonist force, alongside whatever conflicts the factions come into with each other over the course of their campaigns as well. Alongside the introduction of each of these factions, we did get a few shots of their heroes using special abilities, and a couple of voice lines that indicate what some of their primary motivations are. For example, Largo is all about protecting and saving the dragons. He is like a dragon tamer type guy, so he wants to make sure that they're given the respect that they're due. And Garnet and the Scarlet Will have a very direct history with Abysloa and its rulers, and are seeking to recover their strength after they got essentially devastated by the return of the kingdom, as examples. Fairly standard stuff right off the bat, but of course, this is all just trailer information. There's not a lot to go off of until we actually get our hands on the game, or at least a fully fledged demo that can provide us some extra context. Speaking of getting our hands on the game, though, I do want to talk a bit about my experience playing it at PAX East, because it was very enjoyable and surprisingly difficult, all things considered. The hands-on demo I had access to was about 30 minutes long and put you in control of a number of these different factions simultaneously. I had access to Largo and his dragons, Garnet and her resistance fighters, and Purifino and her fairies. And I believe we were fighting against Mistine and the Samurai clan. Now, whether this was just for the sake of being a combat demo, or if this is some kind of fancy meeting of the minds and a great conflict that takes place during the campaign, I'm not entirely sure, but it did serve to provide a pretty wide range of different combat scenarios and abilities, as each of the three factions you were playing with were kind of separated from each other a little bit against other specific enemy factions. And it was a pretty good demo for showing off some of the things that you'd be able to do. For example, Largo and his dragons had an initial complement of enemies that they had to fight, but then Largo was actually cut off from being able to reinforce Garnet by a section of water that he couldn't cross. What I had to do was actually take the power of the dragons using his special ability to gain flight and be able to traverse that territory to then land and continue fighting, because frankly Garnet's forces were getting pretty much devastated. Definitely not because I didn't know what I was doing with them. No. The enemies were just very difficult. We're going to go with that. That's going to be the story we stick with. But it was cool to see that we're going to actually have different ways to navigate terrain, or potentially even manipulate terrain, based on what type of main hero character you're using and what monsters they have at their disposal by using those monsters' abilities. As far as the combat styles of the three different factions, Largo definitely had a mix of melee and ranged, again using these draconic powers, big breath attacks, tail swipes, having some melee attacks of his own, but he was surprisingly not as combat adept as I expected him to be. I had to be a little bit more creative with what the elemental affinities my dragons had were, and how I would be able to use those to weaken or circumnavigate what the enemy was doing, because they had very powerful dark and light dragons of their own that were quickly devastating my forces. I had to be tricky with pushing enemies around, freezing and reducing their stats, and doing sort of hit and run tactics so I wouldn't get blown up on the counterattack. Fortunately, and as one would probably expect for most TRPGs nowadays, there were a lot of bonuses for getting flanks on the enemy or pushing them out of position, having multiple units attacking them simultaneously, etc. For more direct combat capability came Garnet and the Scarlet Will, where I had a number of centaurs, unicorns, and the like that were raining down holy hellfire and lots of arrows from a cliff face down on the enemy. However, what that meant was I needed to be very careful about my positioning, as I was not very good in melee combat with a lot of those units. My unicorns were primarily healers and could do a little bit of light damage, but were very vulnerable in melee combat and very quickly started to get blown up before I realized exactly what their playstyle was meant to be. The centaurs were very powerful, though. I don't know if it's just them being a good monster unit or if archery is going to be particularly efficient in this game, but they were doing a lot of damage and had some good capabilities for some AoE attacks as well with special skills, which I very much was making use of. Garnet herself was a pretty capable combat fighter, and I imagine with specific upgrades or being able to give her certain really powerful melee-focused monsters, she's going to be a powerhouse in melee combat. However, the most interesting front of the battle was definitely with Alicebel and Purfino, as I was fighting against the Samura clan, and they had some pretty dodgy units. Turns out that there's going to be enemies, in particular ninjas, that are going to be extremely dodgy in this game, like statistically baked into their kit, and you're going to need options like magic to be able to hit them with any sort of reliability. Of course, fairies, in most media, typically fairly well known for their magical capabilities, so I was able to do a lot of damage to her once I was able to bash through her supporting retinue of very tanky golems, but I had to play very tricky with actually dealing with those golems while keeping the enemy hero from detonating all of my forces, because she was nasty in combat. Once I got the hang of it, though, it definitely felt like the easiest front to tackle, as Alicebel and the fairies were able to do a lot of damage in fairly short order. I would have then had them running down the cliff and supporting the rest of my army, but I did run out of time on the demo, unfortunately. I really enjoyed what I was able to play of the game mechanically. There was clearly a lot of different monster abilities, tactics, and strategies that you're going to have to take advantage of, and clearly this is a fairly advanced battle compared to what you're probably going to be experiencing when you first dive into whatever section of the campaign you choose to do. So I don't see it being nearly as overwhelming when you start fresh as opposed to jumping straight into this particular slice of the game. That said, I was getting the hang of it pretty quickly, and I'm very pleased to see that my initial expectations of how much there was going to be complexity-wise in the game from what we'd seen of its initial release trailers and associated articles and stuff does seem to be intact. And even then, I imagine this is still not that late into the campaign, so there's probably going to be a lot more that you're going to be able to mess around with and play with. As far as the visuals, controls, sound, OST, all that type of fun stuff, it was a little bit harder to get a read on. Visually, the game is fairly simple in terms of its attack animations. The sprites look nice, but you're not going to have anything on the level of like Fire Emblem Engage with crazy kickflips and parrying and the like. But I think that's kind of good, because these battlefields are clearly going to be quite large, and you don't want to be spending oodles and doodles of time watching all these animations play out over and over and over again when you're going to have 50 units running around all duking it out with each other. It's just not necessary. So in that front, it's totally fine, and the attacks do look nice. They look flashy, they're well animated, but they're more simple, and I appreciate that. The sprites are very good. It's very easy to distinguish what type of monster or hero you're looking at, even from a distance, and the battlefields are pretty easy to read as well, especially with the way you can move the camera around. The actual character art and monster art for their busts and icons are very, very good. Not shocked in the slightest with that, seeing as how we have, the same artist as the Suikoden series, and that has always been a franchise that's been famed for its art, so no shockers there. And unfortunately, I wasn't really able to get a read on any sort of voice acting or music or sound effects because of the nature of the booth that I was at. There was no headphones or anything that you were able to put on and really get immersed into the demo at this particular booth, so I couldn't really hear anything that was going on. We'll have to wait until, again, we get a more proper hands-on demo, maybe through Steam or just full access to the game itself, whatever it might be. I hope that the OST and the sound effects and the VA are all really strong, though, as I found more and more over the years that not really having a very good soundscape for a TSRPG can kind of take me out of it, keeps me from getting as immersed into it. I don't know if you guys have the same feelings on that, but it's definitely been the experience for me, so major fingers crossed on that. All told, even though it was a very short vertical slice of the game, I very much enjoyed my time with it. I would have loved to have had even more time to play around with it, but there was quite the line behind me, so I had to move on. And I'm very much looking forward to getting my hands on the full release as soon as we're able to. As someone who's never played a Brigandine game before, but has always wanted to get into the franchise, it definitely felt approachable being someone who is very familiar with the genre writ large, and I'm more eager than ever to not only play Abyss, but also try and squeeze in one, if not both, of the prior games in the franchise as well. Get a little bit of a baseline before Abyss drops, if at all possible. I didn't have any major glaring issues or anything that jumped out at me as a huge problem right off the cuff. and I walked away very eager for more. As it stands, I'll be keeping my eyes peeled for any other new trailers, articles, and the like that come out so I can discuss it all with you and continue fueling the hype for myself and the rest of the community. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts based on this new trailer, what I was able to show you from the demo, my experience with that, and especially for you long-term Brigandine fans, how are you feeling about what you've seen of Abyss thus far? How does it stack up to previous titles in the series, and are you going to be getting it day one? I'm sure a lot of you probably are, but I always enjoy hearing dissenting opinions and getting the read of the room on how people who are more familiar than I am are feeling about the whole thing. For now, though, I think I'm going to wrap this one up here. Brigandine Abyss, August 26th or 27th, depending on your platform, 2026. It's frankly right around the corner. It's going to sneak up on us faster than you might expect, and I definitely intend to cover it when it fully releases. Until then, though, my name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope that you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there, everybody. And remember, be good to each other, y'all. Bye now.